Small detail about Dark Souls 2 that I actually haven't seen anyone talk about. If we go to the bonfire here in Majula, so in Dark Souls 1, you couldn't hit the bonfires. They simply just were not something you could hit. You would just slice through them. So actually, let's go show that real quick. Let's boot up Dark Souls 1. But you'll notice with the bonfire, I can't hit it. And that's not a big deal or anything, but I've always found it kind of weird in Dark Souls 1 where it's just this object that is a collision. You obviously can't run through it, but it's also not something that you can hit for funsies. And so if we go back to Dark Souls 2, and so the bonfires in Dark Souls 2, if you go to swing at it, you actually can hit it. And they even have like if you're a certain distance away, you can do like like that one, you can see the sparks come off of it, but it doesn't make full contact. But if you're close enough, it will do this, where you'll actually bounce off of it. And that's such a cool little like environmental realism thing that like isn't necessary, and it's not a big deal, and it doesn't make any difference, but it's one of those like little things that I'm like, you know what, that's kind of cool. Let's go check out Dark Souls 3 and how it handles the bonfires, because it's a little bit different. Okay, so here we are at the bonfire in Firelink Shrine in Dark Souls 3, and here there is an environmental reaction to the bonfire, so you can obviously see there are sparks. But the weapon does not actually hit the bonfire at all. It doesn't stop. There's no, pushback on it. And so it's essentially a hybrid of Dark Souls 1 and 2, where Dark Souls 1 had absolutely no interaction with the bonfire, similar to this in that you could swing through it. But Dark Souls 3 does add sparks to essentially where the weapon would be hitting the bonfire, but there's no stoppage. So I do prefer the way that Dark Souls 2 does it. I just think it's cool that the weapon actually hits the coiled sword and bounces off of it, or does the sort of like partial hit and there's sparks coming off of it. So I don't know why they didn't just keep how Dark Souls 2 does it, personally. It could be that they didn't want it to lower your weapon durability, so they don't let you like actually hit it. I could see that, but then again, how many people are swinging at bonfires anyway? Only weird people like me are noticing those differences anyway. But another thing that Dark Souls 2, I think, personally, does the best out of the trilogy is the way that it handles multiple objects. So if you have two souls here, you can see I have two souls of the lost undead. And when I want to use both of them, because I'd like to pop them at once, I can actually hit them, I can hit use, and then it will ask me, how many do I want to use? So I can just boom, use it. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. And when there is, for instance, here I have a large soul of Proud Knight, and I want to use it, I just hit use, it doesn't ask me how many I want to use, easy peasy. And this may seem to you like, oh, isn't this just how all of them work? It's actually not. This, Dark Souls 2 is the only one who does it exactly like this, where if you have multiples, the use option, there is not a use multiple option. It's built in to the basic use option. It is contextual. So if you have multiple and something that can be used in multiples, it will give you the option. Do you want to use multiple? Do you want to use one? Cool. If there's only one, it goes, oh, well, then we'll just use it. We don't need to ask you. And let's go to Dark Souls 3, and I'll show you how it uses multiples. Okay, so here we are in Dark Souls 3, and I have very similar soul items here. So we have large soul of an unknown traveler, we have 4, and we would like to use all 4. And here you can see it has use and use selected. It separates it into 2 different options. So use is for using 1. And then if you hit it, you can then hit use selected, and then you can choose how many. And what I find really weird about this system is that I personally feel like they nailed it with Dark Souls 2, where you could just have the use option. Because the amount of times in Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring, because Elden Ring does this as well, where I hit use and I go, shit, I wanted to use multiple. Because I also think use selected is not a great way to describe that. I think use multiple would be more accurate. But even then, I don't think you need to have multiples of every option here. You could literally just have the use and then let me choose how many I want to use. That's it. That's it. That's the simplified version that I think is the most efficient. Now, that's just my personal preference, but I've always found it weird that they moved to this use and use selected. So now when I want to use multiple, I have to actively go down to use selected, and then it always chooses the lowest quantity, which I find weird. I don't know why it starts at 1 when it's like, well, I hit the use multiple. So obviously I would want to use multiple. I don't know. It's things like that. It's similar to Elden Ring when Torrent dies and that little prompt comes up of like, do you want to use a flask to res Torrent? But it's always pre-selected with no. So every time that pops up, you go, God damn it. Default to yes. Okay? Default to yes. Of course I want to summon Torrent. I don't know. So like that's one where I think they just had UI decisions that I personally don't find to be the most efficient. But Dark Souls 2 here, I think does the best. But that's obviously just my own personal preference of using items and playing the Souls games a lot. I tend to find the Dark Souls 2 method just way quicker. But let's go to Dark Souls 1 for a second. So in Dark Souls 1, obviously originally with like the Prepare to Die edition or just the initial like console versions, right? You couldn't use multiple items at all. That was just, you had to use one. That was it. You use the one and you reopen your menu and you use it again. And you rinse and repeat until you have used those items. And you can get pretty quick about it, but, and then obviously in Dark Souls Remastered, which is what we're running here, or my remastered mod. And if we go down to an item that has multiple that we can use, God, why do I have 96 gold pine resin? I was crushing the game. So here we have 3, and here you can use item, and guess what they do? They took the Dark Souls 2 system because it's, it's just my opinion, but I think it's the most efficient. And so here you can actually choose, I would like to use 3. Now, this is another thing we're going to cover, which actually this will just go straight into that. But if we want to use just something that only has 1, like Soul of a Hero, you do hit use item. Now, here is where Dark Souls Remastered falls down a little bit. It still pops up the specify quantity option when, as you can see, I only have 1 of those. So there should not be a specify quantity option because I only have 1. There's no choice. And so once again, Dark Souls 2 does not make you choose a quantity when there's only 1. It just uses it because it knows, well, shit, you only have 1, so like, we're good, big dog, you know? And so that's a small thing that like does bug me where I'm like, okay, I shouldn't have to hit another option. But in the grand scheme of things, it's very much not a big deal. Now, the other thing that I think Dark Souls 2 does the best is when you're in the inventory for Dark Souls Remastered here, and for Prepare to Die edition as well. So basically, when I want to use this item, I hit use item, okay, cool, and it immediately kicks me out of the interface and doesn't put me back in. It just goes, well, clearly you're done with the inventory, which, as anyone who has popped souls at all, really, in a Souls game, yeah, you're commonly not done. Like, there's another soul I want to pop. Most of the time, there's something else I want to do in the inventory, but the game just goes, I think you're done. And so you have to, once again, go, oh, okay, and then you're back at the top of the inventory, and you have to scroll back through. And so I would have liked if Dark Souls Remastered had changed that, but let's go to Dark Souls 2. And so if we go into our inventory, immediately you can notice that what it does is when you kick into your inventory, it pops your player off to the right in a like cinematic view, and you have your inventory on the left side of the screen, or the left like 70% of the screen, right? And if you want to use things, you just go, I'd like to use that. And guess what? You're still in the inventory. It's awesome. Like, this is the thing where I'm like, y'all nailed it. You just absolutely nailed it. This is how I want an inventory to work, because I can exit the inventory when I'm done, not the other way around. Here, I have the choice of going, oh, okay, well, while I'm in here, okay, let me look at some of my, let me look at some of these. Now, I do think that they probably should have had the right or left, RB, LB for like going through the different or like different types, instead of like having to hit B and then going back out. So like, I get that. I do actually think that'd make it a little bit better, but I think it's just fantastic that you can use objects while you're in the inventory. Not only that, you can just keep moving. You can just walk around, and you have this cool like little cinematic view as you're in your inventory. And it obviously works exceptionally well for, if you want to equip different armor, because you go into your equipment screen and it also does this. So when you're switching different armor sets on, you can immediately see it on your character, and it's not obscured by any sort of menu. And so you just get this immediate satisfaction of like, oh, that's really cool. Now, if they wanted to take this one step further, I do think that like if you're in this screen here, you should be able to switch to a different armor piece without it kicking you back to the main equipment screen. I would prefer that. So I could just switch and then hit B when I want to go back out. So like, I could see a little bit of an advancement there, but this system is exactly what I want. Like, that is just, it's such a small thing, and I once again have not seen too many people talk about that, but like, that is a feature that I really like. So let's go to Dark Souls 3, and let's open up our inventory, which, as you can see, this is so as you saw there, it did look the way that I actually want it, but this is the default inventory that you see here, where it covers the entire screen, and you can still move around just like Dark Souls 2, but you can only see like your feet or your like shins, and so it just blocks everything, which I think isn't really like what I'd want. And then if you hit the something that they, as far as I know, they don't really ever tell you about, other than like at the bottom here, you can see R for simple. But I played Dark Souls 3 for a lot, and I never knew that there was a simple option. I don't think there was ever a tutorial message on the floor that was like, hey, do you want your inventory to be more usable? And you can hit the simple. But there's a bit of a problem with simple though, as what it does is essentially it inverts Dark Souls 2 or DS2's inventory system, where they basically have 70 or 60% of the screen that now has your character on it. But a lot of it is just wasted space, right? Because like my character's in the middle, but then to the right of my character is just a void, right? And you might be thinking, well, is that really a big deal? It's like, well, but now it doesn't show me any of the information and stats that I get on the detailed screen, right? And here you can switch different things. When you go to simple, you just lose out on all of that. And so you're like, well, okay. So I find actually both of them to be not ideal. They're not my ideal inventory setup. And in Dark Souls 3, if you're on the detailed part, and let's say we use this, it does kick you out of the inventory. And I believe, if I remember correctly, if we go to simple, it does not. And so once again, I think Dark Souls 2 has the most efficient and elegant solution, where you get the benefit of both, and you do get to see your character, and you're not kicked out of the menus, but you also don't have to make a choice between this. And so it's another case of like, I think y'all like nailed it. I don't know, like from a usability and UI standpoint, I personally think the Dark Souls 2 solution is just the most straightforward, and there isn't any sort of like, oh, I need to hit a mode to go into a different one to like see. It just feels like it works, but once again, personal preference type of thing. I'm not saying that it's objectively better, because there's just no way that I can actively say that, right? Another thing I really like that Dark Souls 2 does versus the others in the trilogy is the Firekeeper. In Dark Souls 1, which we will go to Dark Souls 1 right after this, and Dark Souls 3, the way they handle the Firekeepers is very different. And so this is a huge personal preference thing where the Emerald Herald is a very core, like, pillar of the story. And she's there the whole time, and she's kind of like helping you through it, and she's important to the story. And so that's very much a difference. So let's pop over to Dark Souls 1 to see how they handle the Firekeeper. And that's it. There we go. We've done it. That's the Firekeeper in Dark Souls 1. That obviously, no, that's not the full story. So her tongue has been cut out, and she also, there's an optional event that can happen where she dies by Law Trek, and basically you can do a quest in Anor Londo, and then she comes back, and she does have a tongue, and then you can talk to her, but it's not a lot of dialogue, and that's kind of really it. Now, Dark Souls 1 has multiple Firekeepers, and I actually think that's a really cool approach they took. And so you have one in Anor Londo. Can I warp with this character? No, I cannot. But in Anor Londo, you obviously have the Firekeeper in full brass armor. And then in Blighttown, you have Quaelag's sister, who is a Firekeeper. And I think that's just really cool. I think, and it could be that like Dark Souls 1 obviously takes place like earlier in all of the cycles, and there hasn't been as many, and so maybe that's why there's still multiple Firekeepers. But Dark Souls 2 moved to there being one singular Firekeeper versus, well, and they also talked about like when you meet the hags of like they were former Firekeepers, so there's sort of like a little bit of lore there. But let's head over to Dark Souls 3 to see how they handle the Firekeeper setup. Here's our lovely Firekeeper. Welcome home, Ashen One, speak thine heart's desire. And her name is Firekeeper. That's as far as I know. And the lore heads for Dark Souls 3 let me know that, do we ever learn her name? I do think it's very intentional. That the Dark Souls 3 Firekeeper is almost like a blank slate in some ways, and I think that's because the tower that's nearby here has a bunch of dead Firekeepers in it, right? And then you can get the Firekeeper soul of like the first Firekeeper, and so there's like lore surrounding that. But at the end of the day, like, she's here for you, and she reminds me a little bit of the Maiden in Black from Demon Souls, which obviously the Firelink Shrine here, I definitely feel is an homage to the Nexus from Demon Souls and its construction and like how it works, and you warp out of it, right? Like that strikes me as that. But I think where I tend to prefer the Demon Souls approach is that the Maiden in Black was very important to the story, and that she is basically the one that goes down with you to see the old one, and it was specifically like about that, right? So like it's a very core component to the story. And the Firekeeper in DS3 does have like an optional ending where you can like summon her. So it's not to say she's not important to the story, and that very likely is a very intentional like design choice, right? Of there's been so many cycles and so many Firekeepers that at this point she is just known as Firekeeper. Could be Firekeeper number 600,001 or whatever. Like at this point, there's been so many cycles, and it's just maybe she's an amalgamation of Firekeepers at this point. So she just says the things. I do think it's very interesting that she says, then touch the darkness within me, which is obviously very much a play on the touch the demon inside me from Demon Souls with the Maiden in Black. So I do think there's some interesting parallels there, but I do prefer the Dark Souls 2 approach, where I think one of the coolest things that they did with the Emerald Herald is that she actually shows up in other locations throughout the story. Not like a lot, but like the ones that right off the rip, right off the dome, on your way to the final boss, she shows up. She also shows up when you see Vendrick, and she also shows up in Dragon Eerie. And so let me know in the comments if I've missed a location where she shows up, but from what I remember, those are the big things I remember, like where she shows up. And so that's what I really love. She shows up in those locations. Not only that, they actually explain why she shows up in those locations and how she can show up in those locations. I think that's just really, really cool. And it just, I don't know, it's just one of the features of Dark Souls 2 I just really love is she's on this journey with you, it kind of feels like, right? And I feel like the other games didn't quite do that. Okay, so something else I wanted to do to show my sort of preference between the three is the intro cinematic. So what we're going to do is we're going to watch the cinematic for Dark Souls 1, we're going to watch the intro cinematic for Dark Souls 3, and then the last thing we're going to do is watch the cinematic for Dark Souls 2. The intro cinematic after you create your character, or even in some cases pre-making your character a la Dark Souls 2, and I want to talk about it a little bit. So we're just going to watch them all the way through, and I'm not going to have commentary while they're playing. So let's play the Dark Souls 1 cinematic.
In the age of ancients, the world was unformed, shrouded by fog. A land of grey crags, arch trees, and everlasting dragons. But then there was fire, and with fire came disparity. Heat and cold, life and death, and of course, light and dark. Then from the dark they came and found the souls of lords within the flame. Nito, the first of the dead. The Witch of Izalith and her daughters of Chaos. Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight, and his faithful knights. And the furtive pygmy, so easily forgotten. With the strength of lords, they challenged the dragons. Gwyn's mighty bolts peeled apart their stone scales. The witches weaved great firestorms. Nito unleashed a miasma of death and disease. And Seath the Scaleless betrayed his own, and the dragons were no more. Thus began the Age of Fire. But soon the flames will fade, and only dark will remain. Even now, there are only embers. And man sees not light, but only endless nights. And amongst the living are seen carriers of the accursed dark side.
And there we go. That is the intro cinematic for Dark Souls 1, and as it plays the little crawl to our character here, um, I love all three intro cinematics for the Dark Souls games. I love all three of the games, obviously. If you followed me on, social media, you would know that. I love all three of them. But for Dark Souls 1, I really do love the cinematic here, and it sets up basically the task ahead of you and what's happening in the world, and it gives you all the lore and background of like what you would need to know, right? And then the bosses, the big bosses, they're very clear and they're named, and you know who the big bads are essentially and who you're going to be facing. So, and like I think that's really cool and like straightforward as a player. It's like, oh cool, these are the bosses I'm going to face. Hell yeah. So man, the specular on this character is a little bit too high, but I am overall happy with how remastered looks. But this is sort of the setup, I don't know, it's in the vein of obviously the Demon Souls cinematic as well, where it sets up a lot of the like, here's what's going on in the world, and here's what's happening in the characters, and like, that's very cool. Oh my god, there's Oscar. So let's go to Dark Souls 3 and play that intro cinematic.
It is called Lothric, where the transitory lands of the Lords of Cinder converge. In venturing north, the pilgrims discover the truth of the old words. The fire fades, and the lords go without thrones. When the link of fire is threatened, the bell tolls, unearthing the old lords of Cinder from their graves. Aldrich, saint of the deep, Farron's undead legion, the Abyss Watchers. And the reclusive lord of the profaned capital. Yon the giant. Only in truth, the lords will abandon their thrones. And the unkindled will rise. Nameless, accursed undead, unfit even to be cinder. And so it is that ash seeketh embers.
And there's the Dark Souls 3 cinematic, which I love. I love how epic it is. It sets up the what's going on in the world, what's the name of the kingdom that we're in, and I love the like unfit even to be cinder. Like that's a hard fucking line. That's a sick line. And then ash seeketh embers. Like, are you kidding me? That's insane. That's so good. But I still think so I do think it sets or it follows the example of Dark Souls 1 of like the named bosses and like what's going on and like the grand scheme of it all to a degree and what's going on. And it's fantastic. And the music's great and it's more epic than ever. And it looks awesome, and so I love that one. It's very, I don't know, it's what I would want, right? Like as an average Souls enjoyer, like that sounds like that's great, that's awesome, that's what I'm used to. But let's go to the Dark Souls 2 intro cinematic, and then I'll talk about why it's my favorite out of the bunch for intro cinematics.
Perhaps you've seen it. Maybe in a dream. A murky, forgotten land. A place where souls may mend your ailing mind. You will lose everything. Once branded, the symbol of the curse, an augur of darkness. Your past, your future, your very light. None will have meaning, and you won't even care. By then, you'll be something other than human. A thing that feeds on souls, a hollow. Long ago, in a walled-off land far to the north, a great king built a great kingdom. I believe they called it Drang Lake. Perhaps you're familiar. No, how could you be? But one day, you will stand before its decrepit gate without really knowing why. Like a moth drawn to a flame, your wings will burn in anguish. Time after time. For that is your fate. The fate of the cursed.
It's so cool. It's easily my favorite of the three. I love all of the intro cinematics. But for Dark Souls 2, it's intensely personal. It's only focused on your character and what they're losing, the curse and what it's doing. And so they show presumably your wife, your child, and then it's almost like a psychological horror type thing where you can see them melting, and then like that last little scene where it's like it's all like fucked up and like your eye goes like wide and black, and or pupil like dilates massively. Like that's so cool. And it's not about the grand like scheme of the world. It's not about the bosses. They don't mention the bosses you're going to face. They don't name them. It's just about your character. And then you are set with a complete blank slate at this point of like, it's called Drangleic. Obviously, there's a curse. And they're telling you in the intro cutscene that you're going to go hollow, which of course is a familiar concept at this point, but it's all focused on you and what you are dealing with. And I love how it directly, like when you drop into that, swirling pool of darkness and whatever, and you immediately jump out into things betwixt. There's something just so cool about that, not to mention the fact that you haven't even created your character yet. I love when people start this game after playing all the others and they're like, wait, is there not character creation? Like, just in retrospect, it's so ballsy to just be like, okay, here's what Dark Souls 1 did. Here's what Demon Souls did. What if we did something completely different? Completely different. And I would say fucking badass. Like, I love it. I just love that intro cinematic so much and what it's focusing on. So it's always kind of struck a nerve with me, or a chord, I guess I should say, not a nerve, as that's like a bad thing. But Dark Souls 2 did something really cool where you could actually hit the A button and immediately skip them. But with Dark Souls 3 and really all the other ones, it's sort of like a delayed skip. Like I'm hitting A, you can hear me hitting A, but none of them immediately react to me hitting the button. I can't tell if it's slightly speeding up the logos, maybe, into like a fade in, fade out type situation, but it's not an immediate response. And so I respect Dark Souls 2 for just allowing me to skip them. And the other thing I like about Dark Souls 2 is basically you've created your new character, and we've had the hags here basically, insult you a lot. And so you imagine yourself as a, first time Dark Souls 2 player. And, Dark Souls 1 came out 3 years prior. You're booting this up. You're like, you don't know what to expect. And, you go to the bonfire. You're like, oh, okay, that's familiar. Got it. Cool. And you sit, and you immediately can hit travel. And you're like, oh, but there's only one location. Maybe, do they have fast travel? Interesting, because in Dark Souls 1, you only get fast travel essentially halfway through the game, which in Dark Souls 1 is not a big deal because obviously the first half is, in most instances, interconnected, right? So the lack of a fast travel system is not really an issue. And if anything, I actually kind of prefer the interconnected nature without bonfires being the fast travel points. For me, that's actually something I kind of hope they go back to a little bit. But booting up Dark Souls 2, and you're running your way towards Majula, which of course, that's going to be amazing. And you're going to go, oh my god, it looks insane. And yes, actually for this video, I am using my, it's Dark Souls 2 lighting engine, and I'm using my Shadows of Drangleic preset, which actually I'm going to take a screenshot here if y'all don't mind for the thumbnail, because I added these light rays, and they might be a little strong, but maybe not. I don't know. I kind of like them. And anyway, so you're heading to Majula, and you're not really sure what to expect, and you're like, okay, I see another bonfire. Great. And then you sit down, you hit travel, and you go, oh, no shot. And so you realize you can fast travel immediately. And I personally think a lot of this was due to the design philosophy around Dark Souls 2 and how the development was very difficult. And they had to sew the areas that they had done together And so I do think fast travel was a necessity. Now, in Dark Souls 3, I would argue they took it a step further, and the hub world is not actually even connected to the rest of the world. You literally have to warp out of Dark Souls 3, Firelink Shrine. And so it took it a step further, and I really enjoy the way that Dark Souls 2 does it, of like, oh, okay, so everything is still, I can run to things betwixt if I want, but I can also sit at the bonfire and just teleport. And I also find the actual interface for the warping system to be my favorite of the trilogy. I do think Dark Souls 3 does a very good job, because anything is better than how Dark Souls 1 did it, where it was just a list with names. And for me, I just have a bad memory, and I can't always apply the name of the warp spot to where it actually goes. And also some of them are named weirdly, like Undead Parish, and then, which the Undead Parish one you would think would go to Undead Parish, but it doesn't. But it actually goes to Andre. But it's not actually, it's his own building separate from Undead Parish, but near Undead Parish. But then there's the Sunlight Altar. And so there's just some weird naming conventions that kind of went on there, but I always would forget where I'm warping to. Not to mention Dark Souls 1 obviously didn't have a warp point. Not every bonfire was warpable, right? And that, I believe, was an intentional choice, as they didn't want to make it too easy to warp around. I guess they wanted you to travel a bit. But I love the menu in Dark Souls 2. And I also, one key thing, let me log out of this character. So here you can see this one shows, yeah, so this actually, Laos Bastille actually uses all 5 slots. And you can see there's one I'm missing. Yeah, I genuinely don't know which one that is, but I love that they give you a little preview of like, hey, maybe go back. Like this one here is actually a slot that I don't even, it has its own square, and the warping point is hidden. So the whole thing is hidden, and I don't know what that is. So that's sort of a hint of like, you just might be missing a whole one-off spot, which I'm sure in the comments someone will tell me which one that is. And then here, and they put actually like 3 question marks when you hover over it of what it's called. I do think that they probably should put the name of the area, because they put it like all the way at the top here, and then the image is down here. I actually prefer if the name was probably closer to the image, so you didn't have to like look up, look down. So I do have my criticisms, but I love this menu. I just adore it. I think it's one of my most favorite like fast travel menus in a video game. And so one thing is the durability system, where weapon durability has always been a mechanic up until Elden Ring, where they did away with weapon durability, which makes sense. But Dark Souls 2 was the only one where it was legit like a mechanic. You can actually see it right underneath your weapon. There's the little red bar, which I can't use my cursor currently, but if I could, which actually I can by hitting F1 in Dark Souls 2 Lighting Engine. But you can see your actual durability listed right below your weapon. It's such a small, understated little menu, but if we go to actually start killing enemies, you'll see my durability actually start to go down, and you have instances where you're in fights or you're out in the world, and you actually need to pop a repair powder. You actually need to be like, okay, I've been away from a bonfire for long enough. I need to go back to a bonfire because that will repair your weapon, right? And I like that it was actually a mechanic. Like, the durability was in the other games, but it was just never, at least for me personally, never something I actually had to deal with. Like 99% of the time, I just was always like, oh, okay, that's fine. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this video of like some of the smaller, less talked about things that I personally love about Dark Souls 2 versus the other ones. And hopefully you've been able to tell from this video that I love all the games. I truly love all of them, like my children. Like, they're literally, I just love them so much, and that's why I literally eat, sleep, and drink. Is that the phrase? Soulsborne? I don't know. But I love all of them. I really do. But I wanted this video to be a little bit about the specific aspects of Dark Souls 2. Not all of them. There's plenty of other things I could have mentioned, but these are the ones that like are just like these little small things that make me really love the game even more. It's like these little touches that I actually hope come back a little bit. Some of them did. some of the things I didn't mention, like stone sword keys, are essentially the Pharaoh's Lockstones from Dark Souls 2, right? Power stancing came back. That was cool. So we had some things come back, but there's certain other things that I would like to see come back a little bit. And yeah, so hopefully you enjoyed this video. I'll probably make another one because there's a lot more things that I think Dark Souls 2 does differently or did first and sort of added to the formula. And so I'll probably make another video. But anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.